I can finally get some rest now. Goodbye, Monday. Oh no, I completely forgot about the biology exam next week. Great, now I can sleep. How do I memorize 5 chapters of Ecology in just 7 days? Did I hear the call of a biology student in need of guidance? Oh my goodness, a talking mosquito. I am not a mosquito. I am a biology fairy. Oh my goodness, a mosquito fairy. Hold on, did you just say biology? Yes, I was summoned here because I heard a student contemplating their life decisions. Please help me pass my biology exam, please. Of course I will. That is my duty. What is your name? Dora. You are learning ecology, correct? Yes. Okay, Dora. You are definitely going to enjoy exploring the biosphere. Exploring? Are you making fun of my name? Whoa, where are we? We are right above your planet, Earth. Wait, what? How am I not dead? You need not know. Anyway, your Earth represents the entire global ecosystem, the biosphere. It contains all of the planet's ecosystems and landscapes. Ecology is the study of organism interaction within their environments, and it can be viewed at several levels of a hierarchy. Ecology at this level is known as global ecology. This is the study of how energy and material exchangement distributes and affects the actions of all organisms. Let's zoom in a bit. Help, I'm falling. Calm down and listen. Below us is a landscape, which I am using to represent landscape ecology, the study of energy, material, and organism exchange across multiple ecosystems. Thank goodness that's over. Here we are in an ecosystem, a community of organic and physical factors in an area. Ecosystem ecology is the study of energy flow and circulation of chemicals between organisms and their environment. Hey, I can see photosynthesis and cellular respiration. What you see here is a community, or populations of different species in an area. Let me guess, this represents community ecology? Yes, it is the study of how species interaction affects community structure and organization. This population is a group of the same species living in the same area. Population ecology is the study of factors that affect population size, and how and why it changes over time. Wow, the bird is bigger than us now. And finally, organismal ecology focuses on how an organism's structure, physiology, and behavior connect to the environmental challenges it faces. Fairy, watch out. Alright, now where were we? Okay, so do you know how ecology and evolution are linked? Do you know about the Galapagos finches? Who doesn't? Right, well, organisms adapt to their environment through natural selection. The length of generations that this occurs throughout is known as evolutionary time. The different survival and reproduction of organisms leading to evolution happens in ecological time, or the time frame of interactions between organisms and the environment. As for the Galapagos finches, the large and hard seeds available during the drought gave the bigger-beaked birds a survival advantage over the smaller-beaked birds, which led to the evolution of beak sizes. Alright, but why do I need to know about this? Learning ecology can help us understand and deal with numerous environmental issues, such as the long-term use of pesticides. People are also curious as to how species are distributed. Why do you think there are less bears on this side of the river? All the food is on the other side. Yep, this would mean that a biotic factor, that means living factor, is influencing the species distribution, or in this case, the berries. Abiotic, non-living factors can also determine a species distribution. So, like this rock? Not necessarily. Temperature, sunlight, water, salinity, and soil are also abiotic factors that can affect species distribution. Anyway, when organisms move away from their population center, they contribute to global distribution, otherwise known as dispersal. Just so you know, dispersal is not the same as distribution. Dispersal influences distribution. I see. I have another question though. How come this bear chooses to stay on the riverside with no berries? This is a good time to talk about habitat selection behavior. The bear certainly can cross the river and get to the berries, but it chooses not to. I think this is because it doesn't want conflict with the bears already in the bushes. Or maybe it's already occupied with that fish. On a bigger scale, this would affect restrictions on species habitat selection. If those bears over there were a different animal species, then a biotic factor may be in play. It might be restricted by negative interactions with another species. And if the other side was extremely hot, then the bear physically cannot live there due to the abiotic factor of temperature. Is it okay to modify the environment like this? Don't worry about that. Now let's talk about climate, the long-term weather conditions in a specific place. For abiotic factors, temperature, precipitation, sunlight, and wind make up climate. Let's look at macroclimate first, or the climate patterns at a global to local scale. Much of Earth's climate is determined by the sun and Earth's movement. When sunlight hits the Earth, different regions will experience different amounts of heat and light. The Earth's rotation around the sun also gives us seasons, though it depends on how far you are from the equator. You probably know that already. Other than the sun, water bodies and mountain ranges can affect climate. Oceans or large lakes can heat or cool air masses, which are exchanged with the land. The Great Ocean Conveyor Belt takes a role in this, as water warmed at the equator travels to the North Atlantic before cooling and sinking. As for mountains, they can affect precipitation and temperature. A well-known example of this is the Himalayas. They block moisture and precipitation on the side away from the coast, which forms the dry Gobi Desert. The seasons will affect day length, temperature, and solar radiation, which varies the climate. The other type of climate is microclimate, or weather patterns that are observable on a smaller scale. Something like a large rock can shelter organisms from more extreme weather by supplying shade, affecting ground evaporation, or changing wind patterns. When climate change happens, like it is right now, we'll see massive changes in the biosphere. Anyway, have you heard of biomes? Yes, they are the result of the combination of different biotic and abiotic factors. Aquatic biomes, which include freshwater and marine biomes, make up most of the Earth's biosphere. As most of the world is covered in water, oceans make up the largest marine biome, which has a big impact on the biosphere. Evaporation from the oceans account for most of the world's precipitation, while ocean temperatures affect global climate and wind patterns. Marine plankton also provides for most of the world's oxygen. Let's go to the sea. Do you need a helmet too? No, I do not. Right now we are in the photic zone, which is where there is enough light for photosynthesis. Below is the aphotic zone, where there is little light. This substrate here is known as the benthic zone, where organism communities called benthos live. Dead matter, or detritus, drifts down to feed the benthos. Benthic zone that reaches 2,000 to 6,000 meters below the surface is called the abyssal zone. What about temperature? Does the water get colder the deeper you go? You're correct, but the temperature comes in layers. A narrow layer of sudden temperature change called the thermocline separates the warm water from the cold water below. In many lakes, water is mixed twice a year in order to exchange oxygen and nutrients above and below. This is known as a turnover. And so, in aquatic environments, communities are distributed in relation to water depth, light penetration, distance from shore, and community depth. The specific types of aquatic biomes are lakes. Oligotrophic lakes are nutrient-poor and oxygen-rich, while eutrophic lakes are oxygen-poor and nutrient-rich. Aquatic plants live in the littoral zone, with shallow, light-efficient waters. The limnetic zone is further from the shore, and supports phytoplankton and cyanobacteria where rooted plants cannot grow, and fish will live wherever there is enough oxygen. Oh man, how come I don't get to float anymore? Wetlands are flooded with water sometimes and support plants that can't survive in water-saturated soil. Since the plants create lots of organic production, the water and soil are low in oxygen, making wetlands efficient for filtering nutrients and chemical pollutants. Other types of wetland include swamps and bogs. Streams and rivers are defined by their current. Streams near the source are generally cold, clear, and turbulent, while downstream rivers are warmer and cloudier. Many kinds of fish and invertebrates live in streams and rivers. Why am I falling again? Sorry, I can't make us float this high in the air. Below us is an estuary, which is a transition between river and sea. Seawater goes up an estuary on a rising tide, and back down on a falling tide. Fish, worms, oysters, and crabs live here. This is an intertidal zone, which is periodically submerged and exposed by the tides. Most animals here have adaptations that allow them to attach to the substrate, such as worms, mollusks, crustaceans, sponges, sea anemones, echinoderms, and algae. Wow, there is nothing here. This is the oceanic pelagic zone, which is basically open ocean water with currents. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface, and supports a diversity of marine animals, protists, and phytoplankton, and so, there are quite a lot of things here. So colorful. This is a coral reef, which is formed from the calcium carbonate skeletons of corals, which are a group of diverse cnidarians. Coral reefs form by coral attachment to a young island, which later forms an offshore barrier reef, and then a coral atoll when the island submerges. As you can see, many kinds of marine animals exist here, with diversity similar to that of a rainforest. Finally, we have the marine benthic zone, which contains the sea floor below the neritic coastal surface waters and the pelagic zone from offshore. Here in the deep abyssal zone, there is no sunlight, and the water pressure is tremendous. I'm doing fine though, and so am I. Near deep-sea hydrothermal vents, assemblies of organisms such as tube worms survive off of the oxidizing of hydrogen sulfide by the chemoautotrophic prokaryotes in their bodies. Now am I going to learn about terrestrial biomes? Yes, to visualize the distribution of terrestrial biomes affected by climate, we make a climograph that compares biomes with precipitation and temperature. Remember that terrestrial biomes can be affected by other factors such as soil quality and seasonality. Terrestrial biomes are defined by their physical and climatic features, including different species of vegetation and organisms. These biomes usually mingle into each other, with the area of intergradation called an ecodone. Many terrestrial biomes feature vertical layering, especially in forests. From top to bottom, we have the canopy, the low tree layer, the shrub understory, the herbaceous layer, the litter layer, and the root layer. Non-forest biomes only go up to the herbaceous layer. Now, in all biomes, disturbance, or an event that changes the biome, happen normally. Storms can make openings for new species to live. Fires even regulate certain tree growth in forests, though as of now, human intervention has replaced many biomes with agricultural and urbanized land. Let's look at the terrestrial biomes. 2. This place is really warm. Tropical forests exist around the equator. Tropical rainforests receive 200 to 400 centimeters of rainfall annually, while tropical dry forests receive a seasonal 150 to 200 centimeters. Plant competition for sunlight here is intense, and so there are many broadleaf evergreens. Tropical forests house millions of species, and have the greatest animal diversity of all biomes. This place is also really warm, but in a different way. Deserts are dry, desolate lands that occur around 30 degrees north and south latitude. They receive less than 30 centimeters of rain per year, and have temperatures either around 50 degrees or minus 30 degrees Celsius. Vegetation is generally low-lying, and has various desert adaptations. Many animals are nocturnal, and include lizards, scorpions, insects, and birds. Existing around the equator, savannas have dry seasons that last for 3/4 of the year. They have similar temperatures to rainforests, though there is more seasonal variation. Trees here are scattered and small-leaved. Otherwise, grass covers most of the ground. Large herbivores like bison and wildebeest live here, along with their lion and hyena predators. Herbivore insects, especially termites, prevail here. On mid-latitude coastal regions we have chaparrals, which consist of small diverse shrubs, trees, and grasses. Winters here are cool and rainy, while summers are dry with temperatures that can exceed 40 degrees. Animals here, such as deer, goats, and small mammals, feed on woody vegetation. Birds, amphibians, and insects also live here. Temperate grasslands have dry winters and wet summers with the temperature frame a bit below chaparrals. The grasses and forbs here can range from a few centimeters to a few meters in height. Large grazers such as bison and horses roam the grasslands, along with burrowing mammals. Northern coniferous forests, or taigas, are found in a band just below the Arctic tundra. Being the largest terrestrial biome, taigas can receive 30 to 300 centimeters of rain per year. Winters can be extremely cold and long, while summer heat reaches just over 20 degrees. Tall, cone-bearing trees dominate the landscape, accompanied by moose, brown bears, and migratory birds. Found in mid-latitudes of mainly the northern hemisphere, Temperate broadleaf forests have deciduous trees with distinct vertical layers. Quite a lot of precipitation is received here, and seasonal temperatures range from 0 degrees in the winter to 35 degrees in the summer. Many mammals that live here hibernate in the winter, while birds are accustomed to migrating. And lastly, most of the Arctic is covered by tundra, which are cold, dry deserts that support mostly herbaceous plants. A layer of permanently frozen soil called permafrost limits the growth of roots. Large grazers like muskoxen inhabit the tundra, while deer and caribou are migratory. Their predators include bears, wolves, and foxes. Some birds such as snow geese migrate to the tundra for seasonal nesting. And phew, that was a lot, for one chapter. Wait, that was just one chapter. What did you expect? On another note, I'm surprised you stopped freaking out halfway through the process. Oh, that's because I realized something. This isn't real, isn't it? It would explain how you could alter the environment without any consequences. You're just messing with my head. Ah, you're correct. In truth, your body is sleeping. Oh, this is a dream. Hold on, won't I forget everything when I wake up? No, you won't. I made sure to hack into your brain and, see you next time. Oh, it's time for school. This place feels familiar. Whoa, come on, it's time to learn about population ecology. Oh, I remember you. You're the fly who taught me about ecology yesternight. Wow, so I'm a fly now? Must I remind you, I'm a biology fairy. Let's not waste any more time. If you recall, population ecology is the study of the dynamics within and around populations. A population is a group of individuals of a species in the same area, and it is defined by its density, dispersion, and demographics. Density is the amount of individuals per unit of area or volume, while dispersion is the pattern of how individuals are spaced within their population boundaries. Most of the time, population size and density cannot be measured precisely due to various characteristics of the population. Ecologists will usually use samples to estimate the density and population numbers. The mark recapture method is sometimes used by counting nests, burrows, tracks, or animal droppings to estimate a population size. Of course, a population size and its density are ever-changing variables. Birth and immigration, the arrival of new individuals, add to population and density. Death and emigration, the departure of individuals, take away from population and density. As for dispersion, there are a few types. The most common pattern is clumped, where individuals are distributed in patches. Certain areas have more advantages over others, and clumping allows for easy breeding and hunting. An evenly spaced pattern, or uniform dispersion, often results from direct organism interactions. Territoriality, or the defense of a space against intrusion, may cause uniform dispersion. Otherwise, environmental factors may be evenly distributed. Demography is the study of population characteristics and how they change over time. Birth and death rates are a big focus here, so we have life tables. These charts contain age-specific data on the survival patterns of a population. To make one, you study a cohort, a group of individuals of the same age. From birth to death, the proportions and numbers alive and dead are recorded each year, with separate columns for both genders. Another way of presenting a life table is by using a survivorship curve. A plot of the proportion or numbers of a cohort alive at each age is stringed together on a graph, one for each gender. There are generally three types of curves. Type 1 curves are flat to start, which means low death rates in early to middle life. It then has a steep drop, signaling higher death rates with increased age. Type 3 drops at the start, meaning high death rates in early life. It then flattens out, which means that the ones that survive. Type 2 falls somewhere in the middle, with a constant death rate throughout their lives. Most species fall somewhere in between everything. When studying reproductive rates, females are the sole focus. A reproductive table summarizes the age-specific reproductive rates in a population. It uses a female cohort, and of course, there is lots of sexual activity variation across species. Now let's talk about the products of natural selection. The life history of an organism consists of the traits that affect its reproduction schedule and survival. It involves when reproduction first begins, how often the organism reproduces, and how many offspring are produced every cycle. Their life history traits are reflected in their development, physiology, and behavior. Big Bang reproduction, or semiparity, refers to the spawn of numerous offspring that happen once in an organism's lifetime. Repeated production, or heteroparity, is the opposite, and refers to continual reproductive activity. The offspring survival rate and the likelihood of adult reproduction is thought to determine semiparity or heteroparity. Trade-offs are commonly made in natural selection. If a parent chooses to care for their young, they might risk their own survival. Selective pressures also influence trade-offs between offspring number and size. Organisms with high mortality rates tend to produce more but smaller offspring, though they usually abandon parenting. On the other hand, organisms with higher mortality rates produce less offspring, but invest more into parenting. What about humans? Humans are an exception to all this, since they have adapted a very different lifestyle. Other organisms do not consciously choose when or how many offspring should be produced. We are now going to do a little math. Oh no, oh yes. The exponential model is a concept that describes population growth in an unlimited environment. Abilities to grow and reproduce will not be restricted, and so the only factors that determine population growth will be birth, death, immigration, and emigration. Here we get this equation. In a mathematical representation, n represents population size while t represents time. Delta n is the change in population size and delta t is the time interval. Just so you know, delta in mathematics indicates change. We now have this formula, where b is the number of births and t is the number of deaths. This can be converted into a model in which births and deaths are expressed as the average number of births and deaths per individual, or capita, during the time interval. The per capita birth rate is the number of offspring produced per time unit by a member of the population. The formula B equals Bn is used to calculate the annual expectation of births in a population. The per capita death rate calculates the expected number of deaths per time unit in a population with the formula D equals Dn. We now get this. This can be simplified again, where R is the difference between the per capita birth rate and per capita death rate. As you might tell, when R is greater than 0, the population is growing, and when R is less than 0, the population is declining. Zero population growth occurs when R equals 0. Now the equation can become this. By the way, this equation does not include immigration or emigration. Now, population increase that occurs while having abundant food and unrestricted reproduction is called exponential population growth, or geometric population growth. The per capita rate would then be assumed the maximum rate, or Rmax. On a graph, a population size that is growing exponentially at a constant rate would make a J-shaped growth curve over time. These J-shaped growth curves appear when a population is introduced to a new environment, or when the population rebounds after a catastrophe. Now, in terms of common sense, the unlimited resources of the exponential growth model is unrealistic. There will be a limited number of individuals that can occupy a habitat, which is known as the carrying capacity. Symbolized as K. Birth rates can also be hindered by insufficient resources for reproduction, while death rates can increase due to disease or parasitism. This ultimately results in a lower per capita rate increase. The logistic population growth model includes how the per capita rate of increase approaches 0 as the carrying capacity is reached. Adding to the exponential population growth model, K will become the carrying capacity. K minus n is the number of additional individuals the environment can support, and K minus n divided by K is the fraction of K that can still support population growth. Now we have this formula. This way, the available resources in K will be able to factor into the growth of the population. On a graph, this produces an S-shaped curve over time. From that, we can infer that population growth is most frequent during an intermediate population, when resources are still abundant and reproduction numbers are high. Of course, the logistic model assumptions of a constant environment and instant adjustment to growth do not work in nature. Usually there would be a lag time before the effects on a population are realized. For example, if an abundance of resources were to suddenly disappear, a species may continue reproducing at a fervent rate. When the lack of food is realized, the population number will drop until the expected capacity is reached. Another unrealistic assumption of the logistic model is that every added individual to a population will always create a negative effect, even though some species may survive better in bigger numbers. Otherwise, The logistic model is useful as a starting point for more complex models. It can also be used for estimating sustainable harvesting in agriculture, or for calculating possible species extinction. The logistic model can also predict different per capita growth rates depending on the population density in relation to the environment's carrying capacity. High-density populations with few resources grow slowly, while the opposite happens for low-density populations with more resources. Life histories will change in favor of these conditions. K-selection is the selection for life history traits that depend on population density near the carrying capacity, while R-selection is the selection for life history traits that maximize successful reproduction in low densities. K-selection and R-selection are both generalizations in life histories, and they are used to develop life history evolution hypotheses. Alright, math time is over. That was a lot to take in, but I think I got it. Good. Density shapes many of the factors that regulate population growth. If immigration and emigration cancel each other out, then populations grow when the birth rate exceeds the death rate, and fall when the death rate exceeds the birth rate. Birth and death rates that are not affected by population density are density independent. Otherwise, lower birth rates or increasing death rates that come with increasing density are said to be density dependent. Because of this, density dependence is crucial to controlling population growth. Examples of this include competition, in which an increasing population fights for fewer resources; territoriality, in which animals fended off have lower chances of survival; disease, in which transmission and contagion is easier in higher densities; predation, in which predators can catch more prey with higher numbers; toxic waste, in which byproducts made by bacteria can poison the organism; and intrinsic factors, in which stressed physiological factors degrade in high-density populations. Let's go to population dynamics, or the interactions between biotic and abiotic factors that vary population size. Population fluctuation in large mammals tends to come from extreme weather, especially cold and wet winters. Parasites in the presence of a high density can also hinder the population. Predation is the second big factor that fluctuates population numbers. Some populations experience population cycles. A case of this is the snowshoe hares and their lynx predators. The lynx population rises and falls in retrospect to the snowshoe hare population numbers on a 10-year cycle. This is obviously due to their predation on snowshoe hares. However, the distinct 10-year cycle may be due to several factors. Winter food shortages reasonably lower population size, though it does not explain the 10-year cycle. Other predators may depend on the hare, while sunspot activity, which happen in 11-year cycles, may affect the quality of plants that hares eat. Further testing proved that predation and sunspot activity play the most significant role in the cycle. Immigration and emigration also influence populations, especially over a mid-population, in which multiple local populations are linked together. In a mid-population, patches of habitat with more individuals can send immigrants to other populations, while places with extinct populations can be recolonized with another group. It is now time to talk about the human population. This should be different, will it? Anyhow, although the human population is no longer growing exponentially, their numbers are still rapidly increasing. It's quite weird to hear this coming from something that actually isn't a human. Human population growth exploded around 1650, when there were only 500 million people. This number doubled in the next 2 centuries, and again from 1850 to 1950 and 1975. There are now approximately 7.9 billion people in the world, with around 385,000 being added every day. As for population dynamics, it varies from region to region. A stable population has equal birth to death rates, whether they be low or high. Going from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates is known as the demographic transition. This transition is related to the increase of quality health care, sanitation, and improved education access, especially for women. The transition to lower birth rates also depends on the region, and what the place is affected by. Many developed countries such as Japan and Canada have dropping birth rates, which is leading to population decline. As with humans, they are able to control their population growth with ways such as family planning and contraception. To get to zero population growth, reduced family sizes, social change, and career opportunities for women that encourage postponed reproduction occur. Age structures, commonly graphed as pyramids, represent the percentage of different age groups in a population. These structures can predict a population's growth trends, as well as their social conditions. Some places may stress the need of a working middle class in order to support the young and the increasing elderly. Infant mortality and life expectancy also vary through human populations. The quality of life at birth can influence life expectancy, which can be seen in comparing undeveloped countries with more developed countries. As for the global carrying capacity, only assumptions can be made. Humans have always tried to estimate the global carrying capacity, with average estimations of around 10 billion to 15 billion. The ecological footprint concept summarizes the land and water required for each person, city, or nation to produce its resources and absorb its waste, distributing all the ecologically productive land among the population, with room left over for conservation. We get 1.7 hectares per person. Anything more than this number for one person is supposedly unsustainable, though the average person in the United States takes up 10 hectares. Consumption of photosynthetic products is another way to go about it, though the process ended up yielding different answers. Speculation over food, energy, waste, and human density are also considered. Some think that new technology will be able to further support the human population, though in the end, it's all assumptions. You humans are the ones that decide your own fates. That almost sounded passive-aggressive. I might feel like having an existential crisis now. Oh, be glad that you aren't learning about astronomy. That's it for tonight. You should wake up any moment. Ah, why am I feeling some underlying sadness? Oh well. Oh, there you are. I assume we will be talking about a different type of ecology tonight? Why yes, you're early. This time it'll be about community ecology. If you remember, a community is a group of populations of differing species that interact with each other. Let's start with those interactions. When an organism interacts with another individual in the same community, it demonstrates interspecific interactions. Plus and minus symbols will be used to denote the positive and negative effects on the two species involved in the interaction. For example, predation is a plus-minus interaction, in which the preying organism receives a positive effect to its survival, whereas the preyed organism receives a negative one, but more on that later. Interspecific competition is a minus-minus interaction in which individuals of different species compete for a resource that limits their survival. The reason being is because fewer resources is not ideal for growth, and both species will experience this. Competitive exclusion occurs when one species uses the limited resources more efficiently than the other, which in turn will eventually eliminate the other competitor. Therefore, Russian ecologist G.F. Gauss, who did an experiment on two protist species, concluded that two species competing for the same limiting resources cannot coexist in the same place. A more elaborated form of this place is known as a niche. An ecological niche is the role of a species within an ecosystem, or a sum of its interactions between biotic and abiotic resources in its environment. And so, two species cannot coexist in the same niche, although, the modification of a species niche can save it from competition. If one species niche was to significantly differentiate from another's in an aspect, they would be able to coexist in a community, otherwise known as resource partitioning. This would make the species' fundamental niche, or a niche potentially occupied by the species, different from its realized niche, or the part of its niche that is actually occupied. Although, competition is important to structuring communities, sympatric, or geographically overlapping populations tend to have more characteristic diverging than in allopatric, or geographically separate populations. This is known as character displacement. If we go back to the Galapagos finches, beak sizes evolved in relation to the food source of different species. Predation is the plus-minus interaction between species in which one, the predator, eats the other, the prey. Generally, predators have evolved senses and adaptations that allow them to locate and catch potential prey. On the contrary, prey have adaptations that help them to avoid death by predation. Other defensive adaptations such as cryptic coloration, or more commonly known as camouflage, helps prey blend in with their surroundings to make them harder to spot. Whoa! Chemical and physical defenses can discourage predators from coming close. Some animals create their own chemicals, while others can gain toxins from the plants they eat. These kinds of poisonous animals exhibit epistematic coloration, which warns predators to not eat them. Mimicry of other species also offers protection. Batesian mimicry occurs when a harmless species mimics a harmful one. They may also mimic behavior patterns. Meanwhile, Mullerian mimicry occurs when two or more inedible species mimic each other. This is advantageous since predators will learn to stay away from a species if eating too many gives them problems. Some predators can also mimic bait in order to lure in prey. Herbivory is a plus-minus interaction in which an organism eats plants or algae. Herbivores also have adaptations, such as sensors that allow them to distinguish between toxic and non-toxic plants, or plants with nutrition. They also have specialized digestive systems for vegetation. Plants can defend themselves against herbivore predators by secreting chemicals or growing thorns. The animals that eat these toxins learn to avoid them after being affected in an unfortunate way. I wonder what category carnivorous plants fall into? Symbiosis occurs when two or more species live in direct contact with each other, and has a couple of categories. Parasitism is a plus-minus interaction that occurs when one species, the parasite, leaches nutrients from its host, harming it. Parasites that live in the host's body are endoparasites, while ones that feed on the surface of the host are ectoparasites. Many parasites have life cycles that involve infecting hosts through ingestion of other hosts. Some parasites can even change their host behavior to increase the chances of being transferred to another host. Because of this, parasites have a significant impact on communities. Mutualism is a form of symbiosis that exhibits a plus-plus interaction, in which both species benefit. Obligate mutualism occurs when one species cannot survive without the other, while facultative mutualism allows both species to survive without the other. Mutualism can affect the evolution of adaptations in both species, so that they benefit more off of each other. Commensalism is a plus-neutral interaction between species that benefits one, but doesn't affect the other. Guesses can be made for these relationships, since they are rare to find in nature. Hitchhikers that attach to other organisms may be commensal, though reproductivity may be hindered. In a situation where one species exploits a resource for another species, it may be considered commensal, such as when herbivores eat the grass that reveals insects for birds. Although, sometimes the birds will eat ectoparasites off of the herbivores, so both species may benefit. Now, we will talk about dominant species. This topic feels 1.5 chapters too late. You can blame the organization of my script for that. What? Anyway, species diversity in a community is the variety of organisms that make up a community. It's made up of two factors: species richness, the number of different species in a community, and relative abundance, the proportion of each species in a community. Ecologists often calculate diversity based on these two factors. This is the Shannon diversity, in which P stands for the relative abundance of each species, and ln is the natural logarithm. How did this turn into more math? We're looking at species abundance. What did you expect? This formula can determine which kind of communities are more diverse by accounting both species richness and relative abundance. Anyway, moving on from that, the structure and dynamics of a community depend on feeding relationships between organisms, known as the trophic structure of a community. A food chain is the transfer of energy through food up the trophic levels. Food chains are linked together in food webs, which connects species depending on who eats who. Here is a basic example. The arrows point from prey to predator. Sometimes, a species can fit into more than one trophic level in a web. In a food chain, a bird might eat a mouse that eats berries, even though that bird may also eat berries. To make this less confusing, different species with similar trophic relationships can be grouped into one part of a web. Otherwise, we can isolate a part of the web that interacts little with the rest. Food chains and webs also happen to be short, with hardly any over 7 links. One hypothesis for this is the energetic hypothesis, which states that food chain length is limited by the inefficiency of energy transfer higher up the chain. Only 10% of energy in the organic matter of each trophic level is passed on. This means that 100 kilograms of plant can support 10 kilograms of herbivore biomass, which is the total mass of all individuals in a population, and only 1 kilogram of carnivore biomass. This hypothesis also suggests that food chains in places with higher photosynthetic production should be longer. The dynamic stability hypothesis states that long food chains are simply less stable. If a population in the lower levels fluctuates, it inevitably affects those in the higher levels. Recovering from environmental setbacks will also take longer in a longer food chain, though most evidence points to the energetic hypothesis. So what happened to talking about the dominant species? I was getting there. Some species have a significantly large impact on their communities, which can occur in a multitude of ways. Dominant species in a community are either the most abundant or have the highest biomass. This means that they have control over the dynamics of other species. There are also a number of hypotheses that suggest why dominant species exist. One hypothesis states that dominant species are just superior in using resources, letting them reproduce easily. Another one suggests that they are simply the best at avoiding disease or predation. This would be able to explain the high biomass achieved by invasive species, which are organisms that are introduced into an environment from elsewhere. On the flip side, keystone species are not necessarily abundant in a community. They exert control over the community structure through their ecological niches. These can be identified by experimenting with removing species from a community. Many times, keystone species are found as controllers for maintaining the balance of a community. Other kinds of organisms influence communities through causing physical changes in the environment, with either behavior or biomass. These species are called ecosystem engineers, or foundation species. Beavers are a well-known example of this. The dams they create can transform landscapes. Sometimes these species act as facilitators, which positively affects the survival of other species in the community. Let's talk about simplified models for relationships between adjacent trophic levels. V stands for vegetation, H for herbivores. The arrows mean that a change in the biomass of one trophic level causes a change in the other. The bottom-up and top-down models are the most common. V to H is a bottom-up model, which means that a change in V will change H, but not vice versa. Nutrients would affect V, affecting H, which would affect P, or predators. However, a change in P would not result in a change in N. Top-down models are the opposite. Predators would control the community by limiting herbivores, which limit vegetation, which limits nutrient levels. Here is the simplified top-down model. Top-down models can be used in situations such as to improve lake water quality. This method is known as biomanipulation. To prevent algal blooms, the density of higher-level consumers is altered. Fish are removed in order to increase zooplankton, thereby eliminating algae. These effects alternate down the levels. Alright, so, a long time ago, ecologists believed that biological communities thrived in a state of equilibrium. F.E. Clements thought that only climate-affected communities, biotic interactions apparently caused the species in this climax community to work as an integrated unit, or a superorganism. A.G. Tansley argued that differences in other factors made stable communities, while H.A. Gleason thought communities formed by chance due to similar abiotic requirements. Ecologists soon realized that disturbance, an event that changes the biome, prevents a community from reaching equilibrium. A while later the non-equilibrium model was produced, which describes most communities as always changing after being disturbed. The most basic types of disturbances are storms, fires, and freezing. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis states that moderate levels of disturbance can better create conditions that makes greater species diversity than levels lower or higher. If you think about it, high levels of disturbance will greatly disrupt a community, while low levels will see rare change. That is not to say that these disturbances are not helpful. Small disturbances can make new landscapes, while large ones are a conditional part of reproduction. Ecological succession is the replacement of a species' colonization again and again through a disturbed area. When this process occurs in a lifeless area, it is called primary succession. Mosses form from spores, of which start photosynthesizing. Soil develops from rocks and the decomposed matter of early colonizers. Grasses, shrubs, and trees overtake the moss and lichen, and proceed to colonize the area with plants and eventually animals. Secondary succession happens when an existing community is cleared by disturbance that leaves the soil intact. The place may return to its original state if left for long enough. Early animals can facilitate the area by increasing soil fertility, or inhibit it, so that later species occurs in spite of the early species. Or, the early species can be completely separate from later species, which tolerate conditions made early but are not affected by early species. I'm surprised that humans have not been mentioned yet. Humans are one of the strongest agents of disturbance today. I either have horrible timing, or you just did that to spite me. Agricultural development, mining, and logging and clearing have disturbed large areas of forests and grasslands. Weedy, shrubby vegetation then dominates the areas for years. Let me guess, now biomes are being heavily impacted. Good, you're catching on. Human disturbance reduces species diversity in many communities, but you shall learn about this another time. Many kinds of biogeographic factors affect community diversity. Areas near the tropic latitudes tend to have more diversity. Climate plays a big role in this, especially with solar energy and water availability. Together, a community's rate of evapotranspiration, evaporation of water from soil and transpiration from plants, can be measured. This is higher in places with abundant rainfall and high temperatures. One of the first biodiversity patterns, the species area curve, was recognized by Alexander von Humboldt. With all other factors equal, the larger the geographic area of a community, the more species it has. These curves help ecologists predict how the loss of a certain area in a habitat may affect a community's biodiversity. Islands happen to be good places to study biogeographic features. On a newly formed island, the rate of immigration and extinction determine the number of species on the island. The island's size and distance from mainland also count in. Smaller islands have a lower chance of immigration due to a harder-to-find size, less resources, and less diverse habitats. Islands closer to mainland will also have a better chance at catching immigrants. These factors make up the island equilibrium model, in which equilibrium will be reached when the rate of species immigration equals the rate of extinction. Though it may only work in a limited number of cases, this model can be used to predict the effects of habitat loss on species diversity. Now that we've went through the important factors of community structures, we can look at community interactions involving pathogens, which are disease-causing microorganisms, viruses, viroids, or prions. Right, I'm familiar with this. Pathogens have the potential to limit populations. Corals, for example, are becoming increasingly susceptible to newly discovered pathogens. White band disease kills corals by causing tissue to slough off in a band near the base. The structure of Caribbean reefs have changed dramatically since. In terrestrial biomes, diseases that kill trees decrease the abundance of many bird species, as well as other animals that were significantly tied to the trees. Studies have found that pathogens are spread by human global economy, and so community ecology is needed to help combat this. I agree. Alright then, you better pay attention. 3/4 of human diseases today are caused by zoonotic pathogens. These pathogens are transferred from animals to humans either through direct contact or through an intermediate species, called a vector. These vectors usually include parasites, such as ticks, lice, and mosquitoes. Understanding parasite life cycles can help scientists make ways to control zoonotic diseases. Extermination of vectors is effective to limiting the spread of disease, although vectors are starting to gain resistance to these chemicals. Community interactions can also be exploited in order to control vectors. Birds that immigrate to certain places can be trapped and studied. For example, because diseases happen more than just in communities, we will need an ecosystemic viewpoint. See you next time. Wait. Before you go, what kind of species are you? I believe I told you that I was a biology fairy. And no, we will not be talking about fairies in a lesson for biology. But how do I even know that you're real? For all I know, you could just be another part of my dream. I think I was interrupted from a dream. Never mind, I don't remember what I was dreaming about anymore. I should get up soon. Oof, I shouldn't have stayed up so late. Look who's late tonight. Well, it's a fair trade considering I was early last time. I guess it doesn't matter. I'll be able to fit the lesson in anyhow. This time it will be about ecosystems, which is a sum of all organisms living in it and the abiotic factors that they interact with. What sets this ecology apart from populations and communities is that ecosystems contain the dynamics of energy flow and chemical cycling. Energy that comes from sunlight is converted into chemical energy, and can be passed around through consumption, or dissipated as heat. Meanwhile, chemical elements are cycled around biotic and abiotic factors of the ecosystem through processes such as photosynthesis. Firstly, you must know about the physical laws. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but rather transferred and transformed. This relates to how solar radiation puts energy into an ecosystem, while heat release from organisms removes it. Photosynthetic organisms also convert energy around, but the total amount never changes. Ecologists learn to understand these energy transfers in order to determine how many organisms a habitat can support and how much food humans can harvest from a place. The second law of thermodynamics states that every energy exchange increases the entropy of the universe. Since energy is always lost as heat during the process, this information can be used to measure the efficiency of certain energy conversions. The law of conservation of mass states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. This helps when determining the dynamics of a chemical element cycling through an ecosystem. Unlike energy, chemical elements are continually cycled. They move through ecosystems as inputs and outputs, such as here. Nutrients in the soil come from rainwater or underground minerals, while gases return to the atmosphere. These inputs and outputs are still small in comparison to the amount cycled throughout the ecosystem, though the balance of inputs and outputs determine if an ecosystem acts as a receiver or a producer for an element. Going back to trophic levels, species are assigned to levels depending on their main source of nutrition and energy. Primary producers, consisting of autotrophs, act as the base of all the other levels. Most autotrophs are photosynthetic, and they provide fuel for cellular respiration by converting light energy. The biosphere's main autotrophs are plants and algae. Otherwise, some ecosystems may use chemosynthetic prokaryotes such as hydrothermal vents. Trophic levels above the primary producers are heterotrophs, which depend on the output of primary producers. Plant and primary producer-eating herbivores are considered primary consumers, while carnivores that eat herbivores are secondary consumers. Carnivores that eat other carnivores are tertiary consumers. Another group of heterotrophs are the detritivores, or decomposers, such as prokaryotes and fungi. They get energy from detritus, which is non-living organic material. I thought we learned detritus as sea rain though. Generally, it's considered as dead matter waste. Anyway, these detritivores are eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers. Detritivores also play an important role in recycling chemical elements. They convert organic materials from all levels into compounds usable by primary producers, which completes the cycle. The amount of light energy converted into chemical energy by autotrophs during a certain time is considered an ecosystem's primary production. Most primary producers synthesize energy-rich organic molecules, which is later broken down to make ADP. Consumers then require their energy through food webs. This means that the total amount of photosynthetic production sets the spending limit for the ecosystem's energy budget. On a global scale, the amount of solar radiation that reaches Earth's surface determines the possible photosynthetic output of ecosystems. Although Earth is hit with 10 to the power of 22 joules of solar radiation every day, only a small amount that makes it to the planet's surface is used in photosynthesis, since much of what the light hits can't photosynthesize. Meanwhile, only certain wavelengths are absorbed through photosynthesis, so only about 1% of the visible light that strikes photosynthetic organisms is converted to energy. This doesn't stop Earth's primary producers from making 150 billion metric tons of organic material each year though. An ecosystem's total primary production is known as its gross primary production, or the amount of light energy that is converted to chemical energy through photosynthesis per unit time. Primary producers also use some of the molecules as fuel for cellular respiration, so net primary production is equal to GPP minus the energy used by primary producers. NPP is usually about 1/2 of GPP, and is used as measurement since it represents the storage of chemical energy potentially available to all consumers in the ecosystem. It can either be expressed as energy per unit area per unit time, or as biomass added to the ecosystem per unit area per unit time. Just to be clear, net primary production is the amount of new biomass added in a given time period, while the total biomass of photosynthetic autotrophs at a given time is known as the standing crop. Tropical rainforests are one of the most productive terrestrial ecosystems, so they contribute immensely to the planet's NPP. Oceans, on the other hand, are unproductive per unit area, yet in total contribute to global NPP as much as land biomes do. Light and nutrients are key to controlling primary production in aquatic ecosystems. The depth of light penetration affects primary production within the photic zone of an ocean or lake. Usually, only 5–10% of light may reach the depth of 75 centimeters. Nutrients, however, limit primary production in different regions. A limiting nutrient is what needs to be added in order for production to increase. Most of the time it is nitrogen or phosphorus, and they are rapidly used up by phytoplankton. Experiments have also found that wind-blown micronutrient iron from land can limit primary production. Cyanobacteria uses it to create atmospheric nitrogen, which is in turn consumed by phytoplankton. Nutrient limitation also occurs in freshwater lakes. Sewage and fertilizer runoff from farms stimulate rapid growth of cyanobacteria and algae, which reduces oxygen and water clarity, or known as eutrophication. This usually causes the loss of fish species. Experiments found that phosphorus was the main nutrient that limited cyanobacteria growth, and so research has gone into making phosphorus-free detergents. As for primary production in terrestrial ecosystems, temperature and moisture work as the main controllers. Warm and wet conditions support production, while cold and dry places are low in productivity. The other biomes lie somewhere in between, with moderate levels of productivity. Actual evapotranspiration can represent these climate contrasts, which is the annual water amount transpired by plants and evaporated from a landscape. Measured in millimeters, it increases with the amount of precipitation and solar energy in a region. Going back to energy transfer, the amount of chemical energy in a consumer's food that is converted to their own biomass during a time period is called the secondary production of an ecosystem. Let's first look at the production efficiency. When an organism eats a plant, only some of the energy is used for growth. The rest of the energy goes towards cellular respiration and fecal waste. The energy in the feces is then lost through heat after being consumed by detritivores. Only the chemical energy stored in herbivores as biomass is available to secondary consumers. Net secondary production is then the energy stored in biomass presented by growth and reproduction. Assimilation is made up of the total energy used for growth, reproduction, and respiration. Production efficiency now is known as the fraction of energy stored in assimilated food not used for respiration. Birds and mammals usually have low production efficiencies due to maintaining a high body temperature, while insects and microorganisms are 40% or more. Now the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next is known as trophic efficiency. They always must be less than production efficiencies, since they also account for the energy in organic material not consumed by the next level. They generally range from 5% to 20% depending on the ecosystem. This means that approximately 90% of the energy available at one trophic level is not transferred to the next, and becomes increasingly multiplied up a food chain. This makes it harder for ecosystems to support top-level carnivores, which ties back to how food chains only contain a few links. A pyramid of net reduction can represent the loss of energy between trophic levels, with the width of each tier proportional to the net production. Biomass pyramids can represent an ecological consequence of low trophic efficiencies. Each tier is the standing crop of one trophic level. Usually, these pyramids shrink sharply towards the top, though they can be inverted in certain aquatic ecosystems due to rapid consumption of primary producers like phytoplankton. This results in a short turnover time for the phytoplankton. For humans, eating meat is mostly inefficient. As per your antics, agriculture could actually feed more people if only plant material was eaten. You may keep this in mind next time you have a meal. Anyway, it may come as a surprise to you that herbivores actually consume a small fraction of plants' net primary production. The green world hypothesis states that terrestrial herbivores are held back by factors such as plant defenses, low nutrient concentrations, or abiotic factors such as temperature and moisture. Intraspecific competition with territoriality, predators, parasites, and pathogens may also hinder herbivore consumption. Biogeochemical cycles are nutrient cycles that involve both biotic and abiotic factors. The specific route of an element through a biogeochemical cycle depends on the element and the ecosystem's trophic structure. We generalize these cycles as either global or local. Gaseous sulfur, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen are present in the atmosphere, and so the cycling of these elements are usually global. Elements that are too heavy to be gases are cycled locally, such as phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. Let's look at a general model for nutrient cycling. This model contains reservoirs of elements, and the processes that transfer elements between reservoirs. Each reservoir is defined by whether it contains organic or inorganic materials, and whether or not the materials are usable by organisms. The arrows explain how elements from one reservoir can move to another. Let's explore the four major nutrient cycles. You most likely learned about the water cycle before. The importance in this cycle is that water is essential to life, and so its availability will greatly affect the dynamics of an ecosystem. Organisms usually harness water in either liquid or vapor form. Oceans contain 97% of the Earth's water, while 2% goes to glaciers and ice caps, and 1% to lakes, rivers, and groundwater. Evaporation, condensation, transpiration, and water flow back to the oceans keeps the water cycle alive. The second kind of cycle is the carbon cycle. Since carbon is the framework for organic molecules, it is essential to all organisms. Autotrophs convert CO2 to oxygen for consumers. of which can come from fossil fuels, soils, ocean water, organic biomass, the atmosphere, volcanoes, or sedimentary rocks like limestone. Photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and the burning of fossil fuels contribute to the carbon cycle. The terrestrial nitrogen cycle is utilized on the ground. Plants and bacteria use two inorganic forms of nitrogen, ammonium, and nitrate, as well as organic forms such as amino acids. Bacteria also uses nitrite, while animals can only use organic forms of nitrogen. The atmosphere accounts for 80% of global nitrogen, while soils, water body sediments, surface and groundwater, and biomass account for the rest. Nitrogen fixation, or the conversion of N2 by bacteria to forms that can synthesize nitrogenous compounds, allows nitrogen to enter an ecosystem. Nitrogen fertilizer, precipitation, and blown dust may also provide significant amounts of ammonium and nitrate. Ammonification decomposes organic nitrogen to ammonium, while nitrification uses nitrifying bacteria to convert ammonium to nitrate. Denitrifying bacteria may also use nitrate instead of oxygen in anaerobic conditions, which releases nitrogen gas in the process. Lastly, the phosphorus cycle gives organisms phosphorus to build nucleic acids, phospholipids, energy-storing molecules, and bone teeth constituents. Inorganic phosphate is used by plants in the synthesis of organic compounds. Marine sedimentary rocks, soils, ocean water, and organisms may contain large amounts of phosphorus. Phosphate is added to soil through the weathering of rocks, though some could leach into groundwater and surface water, which may reach the ocean. When phosphate is used by producers, it becomes distributed throughout the food web, and back into the soil. Only small amounts of phosphorus move through the atmosphere though, since it is not present as a gas. The rates of which nutrients cycle through ecosystems varies from place to place, most likely due to the different rates of decomposition. Temperature, moisture, and nutrient availability are factors that limit decomposition. Just like primary production, warmer ecosystems happen to support faster decomposing, such as in tropical rainforests. This also means that nutrient concentration in soil depends on the speed of decomposition. Higher rates will tend to leave soil with less nutrients, while slower rates the opposite, since slowly decomposing dead matter prevents plants from quickly absorbing nutrients from the soil. Places that are too dry or wet will also slow decomposers. This means that in aquatic ecosystems, decomposition in low oxygen mud can take over 50 years. Even so, aquatic plants will usually assimilate from water. As you know, we cannot complete a chapter without talking about humans. Human activity now affects most of the chemical cycles on Earth. Most of the time, humans move nutrients from one part of the biosphere to another. Someone could eat a piece of food in one place, and later have that matter be transported to the sewage system in another region. Farmland alters the influx of nutrients by depleting them in one place and increasing them in another. Humanity has also introduced toxic elements to the ecosystem. Due to agriculture requiring the clearance of lands with good soil nutrition, intensive agriculture would lead to the exhaustion of ecosystems and soil nutrients. Nitrogen is the main nutrient lost through agriculture. Plowing mixes soil, which speeds up decomposition, and releases nitrogen with the harvesting of crops. Although fertilizers have made up for the lost nitrogen, rather, studies have shown that human activities have doubled Earth's supply of nitrogen available to primary producers. Fossil fuel combustion, industrial fertilizers, and increased legume cultivation are all ways that have increased the fixed nitrogen. But what's the problem with excess nitrogen? Well, the critical load, or the amount of nutrients that can be absorbed by plants without harming ecosystem integrity, is being surpassed. Excess nitrogenous minerals in soil can leach into groundwater, freshwater and marine ecosystems, which contaminates drinking water and kills fish. Although this nutrient fuels phytoplankton, the large lag time in which they die causes low levels of oxygen, which kills more marine animals. This is also what causes the eutrophication of lakes. As we learned earlier, a tighter control over fertilizers and waste dumping have been implemented. Burning fossil fuels and wood releases sulfur and nitrogen oxides that react with atmospheric water, forming sulfuric and nitric acid. This falls down to Earth as acid precipitation, with a pH below 5.2. The pH of streams and lakes are effectively lowered, and the area of effect is being spread over regions with the usage of 300-meter-high generating plants. Fish in lakes and streams die from the pollution, while soil in terrestrial ecosystems changes pH drastically so that nutrients start leaching from the soil. damaging plants. When fish in contaminated lakes are replaced with acid-tolerant fish, the dynamics of food webs sees massive change. Experiments have been performed to reverse the effects of acid precipitation though, and so new technologies have been made to help reduce emissions. Toxin accumulation in ecosystems causes obvious harm to organisms. These toxins can give significant reproductive disadvantages to organisms. Going up the trophic levels in a food web, the toxins become more concentrated in a process called biological magnification. Chlorinated hydrocarbons, which contain PCBs and pesticides such as DDT, have demonstrated lots of biological magnification. Even though DDT is banned in places like the United States, it is still being used to control disease-spreading mosquitoes. These trade-offs result in the approach of using DDT and other toxins sparingly. Meanwhile, many toxins last in the environment for maybe decades. These chemicals can react with other substances to form more dangerous chemicals, such as how the production of plastic using coal can create mercury. Of course, greenhouse gases and global warming are to be touched on here. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, CO2 in the atmosphere has been increasing as the result of burning fossil fuels. One of the consequences of this is the increased productivity of plants. C3 plants could spread into environments that favor C4 plants, which could influence crop replacement. And the thing is, plants cannot straight up use all the CO2 offered to them. The FACTS-I experiment produced results that showed how the availability of nutrients such as nitrogen limits temperate tree abilities to use CO2. The planet's heat budget is also being affected by rising concentrations of greenhouse gases. Gases and water vapor in the atmosphere increasingly absorb radiation emitted from Earth and reflect light back, retaining the solar heat. This is known as the greenhouse effect. Because of the increased CO2 in the atmosphere, scientists believe that it contributes to the rising global temperature. As heat melts surface ice, less light is reflected off of Earth. This also decreases the habitat of polar animals. Meanwhile, the number of forest fires has been increasing. To slow global warming, energy use can be switched over to renewable power such as hydro, solar, wind, and nuclear power. Atmospheric ozone has been depleting due to the accumulation of chlorofluorocarbons. The ozone layer is important to Earth as it is the only protection against UV radiation. The chlorine in CFC reacts with ozone in the atmosphere, reducing it to oxygen gas. The most significant thinning of the ozone layer occurs over Antarctica in what we call the ozone hole, which has been extending as far as Australia, New Zealand, and South America. Increased UV radiation means the increased risk of skin cancer and DNA damage. Though if you want something to smile about, the ozone hole has closed as of January 6, 2021, and we're done for tonight. Wow, I guess we already breezed through 4 chapters. Also, do you have a grudge against humans or something? You seem very passive-aggressive. Well, us fairies also live on this earth, and we can't really do anything about the deteriorating condition of the planet. So, do what you will with the earth. It's the weekend tomorrow. Okay, I'm ready for our last learning session. You sure sound excited. Make sure to study over the weekend. You'll need to retain this information until Monday. Alright, it's time you learn about conservation biology and restoration biology. Conservation biology combines ecology, physiology, molecular biology, genetics, and evolutionary biology to conserve biological diversity, while restoration biology is the study of returning ecosystems that have been disturbed by human activity back to their regular state. It really does feel like everything I've learned so far was to build up to this point. First and foremost, extinction has always been present. Humans simply speed up the rate of extinction to a point where Earth's biodiversity is threatened. There are 3 levels of biodiversity, and we'll go through them one by one. Genetic diversity contains the individual genetic variation within a population and the genetic variation between populations. If a population goes extinct, genetic variation is lost, which reduces the adaptive capabilities of the species. Humans are also affected by this, as the extinction of wild plant populations related to agricultural crops would mean losing genetic resources that could have been used for breeding. Species diversity is the diversity of species in an ecosystem or within the biosphere. Endangered species are defined as in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. According to the Endangered Species Act, Threatened species are ones considered likely to become endangered in the future. Ecosystem diversity is the diversity of the biosphere's ecosystems, with the complex interactions between organisms in an ecosystem. The extinction of one species may greatly deter the whole network. Humans should care about biodiversity, especially since the benefits it provides usually get taken for granted. Medicine is commonly made from plant substances, and is a huge advantage when it comes to survival. The variation of plants helps humans to develop cures for a variety of diseases. The unique genetics of every species contains great potential, and so it would be a waste if it all disappeared without knowing. Ecosystem services are defined as benefits humans acquire through using the ecosystem. They help purify water and air, detoxify and decompose waste, and reduce the impacts of extreme weather, all for free. Biodiversity helps to perform these actions, and so human activities threaten the planet's capability to support the human race. There are three major threats that human impact has on biodiversity, the first of which is habitat loss. Agriculture, urbanization, forestry, mining, and pollution are all factors that destroy habitats. When a species has no habitat to stay in, they face extinction. The clearing of tropical rainforests particularly damages habitats, due to the large biodiversity of species that live there. Habitat fragmentation, which is the splitting and disturbance of a habitat, causes species loss. Affected smaller populations have a higher chance of local extinction as well. Aquatic ecosystems also suffer habitat loss through the destruction of coral reefs and the creation of dams. The second threat to biodiversity are introduced species. These species are either intentionally or accidentally moved by humans from their native habitat into a new location. With their eliminators gone, they become free to spread everywhere. This usually affects the community through the introduced species through predation and competition, not to mention human populations as well. Even good-willed human-introduced species can cause harm, as can be seen by the kudzu plant, which was initially brought to help with erosion. Lastly, overexploitation is the human harvesting of wild organisms at rates that exceed the reproduction rate of the population, which can hunt species to extinction. Large animals with low reproduction rates are especially susceptible to overexploitation. Conservation biologists use molecular genetic tools to track tissue origins from endangered or threatened species to make maps for determining illegally harvested species. Most of the time, overexploitation occurs due to the increasing demand for resources of the growing human population. There are two approaches when it comes to populations. The small population approach is used when species are defined as endangered when it has a very small population. This is because usually, small populations are susceptible to overexploitation and have a higher chance to die out. The extinction vortex is described as a positive feedback loop in which inbreeding and genetic drift draws the population smaller and smaller until it no longer exists. The loss of genetic variation, which is caused by inbreeding and genetic drift, drives the vortex since evolutionary responses are not perceived. Inbreeding also increases the chance of offspring to receive recessive diseases. Although in rare cases, a population may fare well even with low genetic diversity. Determining the size of a population before it heads down the extinction vortex depends on many different factors. The minimal population size that allows a species to sustainably survive is called the minimum viable population. The calculation for this requires many factors, such as the estimate of how likely a small population is to be killed by an extreme weather event. Meanwhile, the effective population size is based on the breeding potential of the population. Incorporating the sex ratio of breeding individuals into the estimate of effective population size gives us this formula. NF and NM are the number of females and males that successfully breed. Of course, due to the factors, there are many variations of this formula. Population MVP is usually used in population viability analyses, in order to predict a population's chances for survival over a given time period. This helps biologists to foresee the consequences of management plans. The declining population approach looks at endangered and threatened species on a downward trend, without regarding their population number. A population must be studied case by case in order to determine the area that needs fixing. There are 5 steps to analyzing declining populations. 1. Using population data, confirm that the species is currently in decline. 2. Study the history of this and related species to determine the species' environmental requirements. 3. Make hypotheses for all possible decline causes, and list the hypotheses' predictions. 4. Test the most probable hypothesis first. 5. Use the results to manage the species and monitor its activity. Since conflict is natural, biologists also have to weigh a species' demands against other needs. An animal's survivability might intervene with essential human activity, such as habitat needs versus the timber industry. The ecological role of a species is also considered in this debate, especially since not all endangered species can be saved. The conservation of a species could negatively affect the population of another species too. To find a rational answer, different perspectives should be used. Conservation biology also aims to conserve landscapes. The edges between ecosystems define landscapes. An edge is discerned by the differing physical conditions on either side. Sometimes edge communities are formed when organisms survive off of resources from both sides. The effects of these communities can be both good things and bad things, since when they get too comfortable, they can barge into the production of other species. In fragmented habitats, a movement corridor is a strip or clumps of habitat that connect isolated patches, which can be important for maintaining biodiversity. Artificial corridors, such as bridges, are sometimes used in areas of high human activity. These corridors can promote dispersion and inbreeding in declining populations, but can also be harmful in ways of spreading diseases across habitat fragments. To slow the loss of biodiversity, governments have set aside 7% of the world's land in forms of reserves. The choosing of locations are challenges themselves, since many things need to be considered when letting a species loose in a habitat. A biodiversity hotspot is usually a small place with an exceptional concentration of endemic species and a large number of endangered and threatened species. In total, the hottest of terrestrial biodiversity hotspots are less than 1.5% of Earth's land, but house more than a third of plants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Most of the time, the designation of a hotspot is biased towards saving vertebrates and plants. Nature reserves are usually protected, and are set to remain unchanged. However, as disturbance is an integral part of ecosystems, reserves without it will usually lose biodiversity. There is also a question as to whether or not fewer large extensive reserves or more small reserves should be created. For example, far-ranging animals with low-density populations require extensive reserves. Another approach to this are zoned reserves. These are regions that include areas undisturbed by humans surrounded by places changed by human activity. There are regulations that prevent the impact of these alterations on the reserve, so that the edges can act as buffers against intrusion. Reserves are much less common in the ocean than on land, even though marine ecosystems have also been heavily impacted. Some approaches to prevent fishing and harvesting in certain areas. Recreational divers also favor the increased marine life in these reserves, which doubles as an economic gain. To restore degraded ecosystems back to a natural state, it takes a lot of time, and is usually slower than rates of human degradation. One part of restoration ecology is to speed up the process of restoration, which includes two strategies. Bioremediation is the strategy of using organisms to detoxify polluted ecosystems. Plants adapted to soils with heavy metals are used to regulate areas polluted by human activity. Prokaryotes are used to purify soil and water, and have even been genetically sequenced to carry out their full potential. Biological augmentation, on the other hand, uses organisms to add materials to a degraded ecosystem. The first step is to determine what nutrients have been removed from an ecosystem, and add in the necessary organisms. After the environment has been tempered to the right conditions, other organisms can be added in. Restoration ecology is still a relatively new process, so ecologists will usually experiment with several different types of management to learn what works best. Let's go through some real-life examples. In Costa Rica, agricultural clearing has destroyed 98% of tropical dry forests in Central America and Mexico. To reverse this, domestic livestock have been used to disperse the seeds of native trees into open grasslands. In Europe, dredging and channeling for navigation have straightened and disconnected the Rhine River from its floodplain and wetlands. Many countries along the Rhine are working together to reconnect the river to its channels to increase the diversity of habitats, improve water quality, and provide flood protection. Along coastal Japan, seaweed and seagrass have been reduced from human development. To restore the seabed, construction of seafloor habitat, transplanting from natural beds, artificial substrates, and hand seeding have been used. It is also important to stay sustainable while conserving biodiversity, and so humans must decide how to prioritize habitats. The concept of sustainable development meets the needs of humans without limiting the ability of future generations to survive. The world's largest organization of ecologists, the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative, has made its goal to define and obtain the ecological information needed to develop, manage, and conserve Earth's resources as responsibly as possible. Personal values and different perspectives must be assessed to reach the goal of sustainable development. The concept of biophilia describes that since humans evolved in a natural environment, they would still have an affinity for nature. The desire to understand and appreciate nature is what keeps biology alive, and that is the end of the lesson. I guess that's it. Will I be able to see you again? Probably not, but wouldn't you want to know my grades? I already know your grades. Just kidding. As long as you understand what you learned, I don't need your grades. You also won't remember me when you wake up. Have fun on the exam. Hey, I did better than I expected.